Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World Talks. Ukraine has become one of the hardest topics of the presidential campaign in Poland after the main opposition candidate stated that Kyiv would need to recognize its wrongdoings against Poles during World War II in order to get his backing for the EU and NATO bids. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has stated he would like to end the war in the next 6 months and expressed her willingness to meet with Vladimir Putin as soon as possible. To talk about it and more, we're joined by Taras Kuzio, Professor for Political Science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla. Good evening, Professor.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for accepting it. Now, let's start with the Volhynia issue. Now, do you believe this is the end of it? Because it has been something that divided Poles and Ukrainians for many decades now. Now, do you believe that this announcement by the Polish Prime Minister that exhumations are about to begin will put an end to this diplomatic conflict?
No, I don't, unfortunately. And the reason for that is that Polish I think people and have a kind of victimization complex about this. There's no question that massacres took place, but unfortunately the Polish side never seems to take into account there were also massacres of Ukrainians, and they exaggerate the number of Polish victims. I mean, you mentioned earlier a few minutes ago that it was 120,000, which is an exaggerated figure.
And what is the correct figure according to you, Professor?
Not according to me, because I'm not a historian, but Western historians who are objective, like Timothy Snyder, who's very pro-Polish, Professor Mogoci, chair of Ukrainian history in Toronto, they all have approximately similar figures of about 60,000 Poles who were murdered and about 20 to 25,000 Ukrainians. Unfortunately, the Polish side never includes the Ukrainians who were murdered. And they were murdered in different areas. The Poles were murdered in Volhynia, which had a very large Ukrainian population, and there were, of course, not only ethnic conflicts there, but religious, because the Ukrainians there were Orthodox against Catholics. But the Ukrainians were murdered in the borderland areas, the so-called Zakarzony region. And I know, I have friends whose relatives were killed in that area. So we need to take into account both sides. Ukrainians have never said that these, except for maybe some extreme nationalists, but most Ukrainians will accept that there were massacres that took place. But what I think needs to be accepted by the Polish side is that there were massacres on both sides. For example, one of the heroes in Poland today is a partisan from that period of time called Volhynia. A book was published by the Polish Institute of National Memory about him. He was involved in massacres of Ukrainian villages. So when we talk about the need to reconciliation, there should be steps taken on both sides.
And for many Poles, the very emanation of evil is Bandera, Stepan Bandera, right? Who was the leader of Ukrainian nationalists. So we can clearly see that this is an issue that still needs to be resolved. Let's put it aside now. Let's talk about Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So both leaders apparently want to meet to discuss peace in Ukraine. Now, realistically speaking, should we expect any immediate stop to the bloodshed in Ukraine, or should we rather expect a lengthy negotiations?
Unfortunately, Donald Trump resembles, and I say this as somebody who lectures at university, Donald Trump resembles a first-year undergraduate student on international affairs. He simply doesn't understand the complexities of this conflict. I think he understands maybe more than before when he talked about he would resolve it within 24 hours. Now he's saying 6 months, and he's saying it's more complicated than the Middle East. But of course, this is a complicated question because this is to do with a country, Russia, in effect adopting 19th century imperialism to eradicate, commit genocide against the people. And I don't think this has really sunk in. I think that we've only seen vague proposals until now, and the proposals we've seen seem to indicate that Ukraine is more likely to agree to those than Russia. What does Putin want? Putin wants something that even Poland and the Baltic states and Scandinavia would be totally against. Putin wants a second Yalta. He wants to sit down with the Americans, with Trump, and to negotiate a Yalta II agreement where the Americans accept that the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe again belong to Russia's sphere of influence. Now, this would be impossible to do today, but that's what Putin's goal is. The proposals we've heard until now, Ukraine would be maybe acceptable of those, but because they will never go as far as what Russia wants, it will not. But I think to be honest, the biggest difficulty here is the question of peacekeepers. I mean, where are we going to find in Europe 50 to 60,000 troops who would man a potential peacekeeping line between Ukraine and Russia? I mean, it would have to come from big countries with big militaries, so that would include Poland, Britain, France, maybe some other countries. Germany is unlikely to, because of its history, to send troops. So that is going to be difficult. And secondly, it's going to be difficult to kind of agree to some concrete security guarantees. Ukrainians are very skeptical of security guarantees because of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which Ukraine received security guarantees for denuclearization, which were completely ignored in 2014 by President Obama and British Prime Minister Cameron. So this is a very complicated question, and I do not see it being resolved very quickly at all. Sadly.
But don't you fear that actually Ukraine may be a subject to negotiations rather? An object of negotiations rather than its subject, that the two leaders, I mean Putin and Trump, will just strike a deal between themselves and forget about the role of the Ukrainian president, because well, the Ukrainian president stands strongly on his position that Ukraine should not cede any of its territory to Russia. But then again, Russians would be more than happy with freezing of the conflict. And as I guess what you just said means that that the new U.S. administration is willing to accept the state of things as they are right now. So, is there any room for negotiations?
I think there's room on the Ukrainian side, but not on the Russian side. Ukrainians would be willing to accept a freezing of the conflict, which means a temporary occupation of 20% of their territory, in return for an ending to the ongoing hot war, as it were, which means an ending to missiles and drones and fighting. But I don't think the Russians would ever agree to that, because Putin has not achieved any of his objectives. His objectives were to destroy Ukrainian statehood and destroy Ukrainian identity and occupy the big cities of Ukraine, which Russian nationalists call Russian, like Kiev, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa. He hasn't achieved any of those goals. In fact, the four regions that Russia annexed are still not occupied 100% by Russia. So I think the Ukraine would be willing, but Russia won't. I cannot see this what you asked about, this idea of Trump and Putin negotiating something over the heads of Ukrainians and of Poles, by the way, Poles and the Baltic states, as was done in 1945 at Yalta, because it wouldn't happen today. I just cannot see that. Even if, for example, Trump and Putin signed something together, why would that mean Ukraine would agree to it? Ukraine could say, to hell with you, we're not agreeing to that. And I think there's already enough.
Is Ukraine in a position? Is Ukraine in a position to oppose any deal?
Yes, it is. I think it is for a number of reasons. Firstly, Ukraine has built up a very strong domestic military industrial complex with its own resources and with support from the West, particularly like countries like Denmark, Poland, and other countries. European countries would never accept such a deal, such a kind of a Yalta II agreement, because this would be an existential threat to Europe. They would see it, particularly countries bordering Ukraine, the Baltic states, Scandinavia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania. So yes, Ukraine has said that it has enough capacity, enough military resources to continue until the middle of this year. And the Biden administration has just just sent Ukraine a huge amount of new military aid. Let's not also ignore one important factor. The Russian economy and the Russian state of finances may not survive the end of this year. The Russian economy is in desperate straits. The Biden administration introduced today massive financial sanctions against the Russian oil sector, which is the main money earner for the Russian government. And it should have been done 2 or 3 years ago, but it's been done today. And so I think that it's not just a question, can Ukraine survive? Will Russia survive itself?
Well, there was no shadow fleet like 2 years ago, but and these measures are against the
overdue. They're overdue, of course.
Absolutely so. Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla was our guest this evening. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.